Yaakov bar Yosef akhui de Yeshua, carved into dull, ancient limestone, letter by agonizingly ancient letter. The literal translation from the cursive Aramaic script is incredibly simple, but it is the exact kind of simple that brings empires to a grinding, violent halt. James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. It is a stone box, an ossuary, the box that was supposed to finally, tangibly prove the physical, historical existence of the biological family of Jesus of Nazareth. But instead of being placed in the center of a grand cathedral, and instead of being printed in every history textbook on the face of the earth, this simple limestone box ended up locked in a criminal courtroom for 7 long years. It became the center of the longest, most vicious, most expensive archaeological forgery trial in modern human history. And nobody ever told you how that trial actually ended. Listen, this is not some fringe internet conspiracy theory. We have the documents. We have the court records. In November of 2002, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto exhibited this exact box. They rushed it into a highly secure glass case, and nearly 100,000 people lined up in the freezing cold just to spend a few seconds looking at it. The public went absolutely wild. But then, the State of Israel stepped in. The Israel Antiquities Authority convened a special committee in 2003, declared the inscription to be a modern forgery, and had the owner arrested by the police. They raided his apartment and found a literal, fully functioning antiquities forgery workshop inside his home. The trial that followed lasted 7 exhausting years. They heard testimony from 138 witnesses. They logged over 400 physical exhibits and transcribed 12,000 pages of sworn testimony. State of Israel versus Oded Golan. It was a bloodbath of academics, scientists, and lawyers. And you probably never heard a single word about it in church. In today's video, I am going to show you exactly what happened to the James ossuary. I am going to show you where it came from, the brutal institutional war over its authenticity, the actual microscopic science they fought over in court, and why the final verdict threatens both the hardcore skeptics and the absolute believers. And before we finish today, I am going to show you the real reason why an institution will spend millions of dollars and 7 years of its life trying to destroy a piece of limestone. But before we start, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This is incredibly important for the YouTube algorithm to understand that this deep research has real value for you, and it tells YouTube that you want to see more investigative historical videos just like this one. The hardest thing for any institution to control is not a lie. The hardest thing to control is a piece of physical evidence that refuses to fit into their pre-approved box. When I was teaching world history at a Catholic high school in Evansville, Indiana, I used to spend my free periods hiding out in the school library. I loved the quiet in there. I remember pulling out this massive, heavy encyclopedia of Biblical Archaeology from the bottom shelf. It was the official reference book for the entire theology department. But as I flipped through the heavy pages looking for context on 1st century Judea for my next class, I realized something incredibly strange. The timeline of discoveries just stopped in 1990. There was absolutely nothing in there about any recent finds. Nothing about the James ossuary. Nothing about the fierce debates raging in the modern archaeological community. I brought this up in the teacher's lounge one afternoon. I was talking to a science teacher, a guy who was aggressively skeptical about everything religious. We got into this intense, hour-long debate about whether physical archaeological proof could ever actually validate or invalidate a sacred text. He looked at me and said, "Nathan, you can't dig up God with a trowel." I argued that stones don't speak, but stones are the only things that don't lie. We went back and forth, and neither of us gave an inch. But that conversation stayed with me for years. Eventually, when the school administration forced my resignation, one of the main charges they threw at me was that I was constantly bringing unverified material into my classroom. The irony of that is just staggering to me now. They fired me for exploring unverified history, and yet, here we have a stone box that the entire Israeli justice system spent 7 years trying to verify, and they still could not force a simple answer out of it. To understand where this box came from and why it terrified so many people, we need to go back in time. And we need to understand exactly what an ossuary is. First-century Jewish burial practice in Jerusalem was very specific. When someone died, their body was placed inside a burial cave, wrapped in a simple shroud. After about a year, when the flesh had entirely decayed and only the bones remained, the family would return to the cave, gather the bones, and place them into a small box carved out of local limestone. That box is an ossuary. It was a cultural practice that only lasted for a very narrow window of time, ending abruptly when the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem and burned the Second Temple to the ground in the year 70. This gives us a perfectly sealed time capsule. Oded Golan, an Israeli engineer and major antiquities collector, claimed he bought this specific ossuary in the 1970s from an antiquities dealer in East Jerusalem for a few $100s. For decades, it just sat in his collection. Nobody paid any real attention to it. Golan himself didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the Aramaic inscription carved on its side, because he wasn't an expert in ancient epigraphy. Until October of 2002. That is when a man named Herschel Shanks, the founder of the Biblical Archaeology Society, held a massive press conference in Washington, D.C. He announced to the world that a highly respected epigrapher, an expert in ancient writing, from the Sorbonne University in Paris had examined the box. The expert's name was André Lemaire. Lemaire had published his peer-reviewed findings in the Biblical Archaeology Review in November of 2002, and his conclusion was absolute dynamite. Lemaire stated that the cursive Aramaic script, which spelled out Yaakov bar Yosef akhui di Yeshua, was completely consistent with authentic first-century lettering. Every single curve, every etching technique, matched the specific period before the destruction of the temple. But it wasn't just the handwriting, it was the statistics. In first-century Jerusalem, the names James, Joseph, and Jesus were relatively common. But the statistical probability of those 3 specific names appearing in that exact familial combination, a man named James, whose father was Joseph, and who had a brother named Jesus, famous enough to be listed on a burial box, was incredibly low. Epigraphers note that the word brother in a funerary inscription was a formal, literal designation. It was almost never used loosely for a distant relative or a friend, because the whole point of the inscription was to identify the specific owner of the bones among a crowded family tomb. When you run the demographic math of Jerusalem at the time, Lemaire concluded that this was pointing to a real, notable family relationship. The global reaction was instantaneous chaos. In November of 2002, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto decided they could not wait for years of academic debate to play out in obscure journals. They rushed to put the ossuary on public display. They flew it to Canada, put it in a highly secure glass case, and opened the doors. The line stretched down the street in the freezing cold. Nearly 100,000 people paid to see it in just 7 weeks. Prominent archaeologists were absolutely furious at the museum. Eric M. Myers called the museum's decision completely reckless. Another well-known archaeologist, Joe Zias, went on the record and bluntly stated, "They saw the opportunity to make a fast buck, and they did it." But the people standing in that line didn't care about academic protocol. They didn't care about peer review. They were looking at what might be the first physical, tangible link to the family of the historical Jesus. For 2,000 years, faith had been entirely text-based and spirit-based. Now it was sitting in a box made of solid rock. And for understanding how this threatens the system, we have to look at the religious context. If Jesus had a biological brother named James, born of Joseph and Mary, it completely shatters the deeply held Catholic dogma of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Protestant traditions accept that Jesus had siblings, but for the Catholic institution, a physical box proving a biological brother is a catastrophic theological problem. And for secular historians who argued Jesus was entirely a myth, Physical evidence of his family is equally devastating. The box was a direct enemy to almost everyone in power. For understanding where this goes next, we need to jump forward to 2003, because the Israel Antiquities Authority was not about to let a private collector rewrite the history of the first century. Let's go there. In 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority, the official, powerful government body responsible for all archaeological finds in the state, formed a special committee. Their mandate was to examine the James ossuary and determine its authenticity once and for all. They gathered experts, they ran tests, and they delivered their verdict. And their conclusion was a brutal, devastating blow to the believers. The committee published a report in 2003 declaring the second half of the inscription, the "Brother of Jesus" part, to be a modern forgery. They conceded that the limestone box itself was genuinely from the first century, but they claimed that a modern forger had recently carved the words "Brother of Jesus" into the ancient stone to artificially inflate its financial value and its historical significance. Based on this official government committee report, the Israeli police moved in with full force. They arrested Oded Golan, and when they raided his apartment in Tel Aviv, they found something that seemed to instantly validate every single skeptic's worst nightmare. Inside his home, the police found a literal, functioning antiquities forgery workshop. They found modern tools, half-finished fake antiquities, and soil samples from different historical eras clearly meant to be used for creating fake patinas. If you were reading the newspaper headlines in 2003, the case was completely closed. It was over. The official government body called it a fake. The owner literally had a forgery lab in his house. The media ripped the entire story to shreds. The believers who had waited in the freezing cold in Toronto were mocked on national television. The academic establishment took a massive victory lap. Let's look at the raw arithmetic of this situation. You have a private collector. You have one old stone box. And on the other side, you have the entire Israel Antiquities Authority, the Israeli police force, the global media establishment, and a literal forgery workshop found in the guy's living room. The math does not close. There is no mathematical way the authenticity of this box survives this level of institutional crushing. So why, if the case was so incredibly obvious and the evidence was so overwhelming, did the State of Israel spend the next 7 years locked in a brutal courtroom battle over it? Why didn't they just throw him in jail and throw the box in a warehouse? The answer to that question is hidden in the place almost nobody looks. It is hidden in the microscopic dust. And the problem doesn't stop here. There is a part of this story that the media completely ignored. When you carve into an ancient stone, you leave a microscopic, permanent signature. Over hundreds and thousands of years, stone develops a very thin surface layer called a patina. It is a biological and chemical crust formed by time, moisture, and microfossils bonding to the rock. The concept of patina works exactly like the crust that forms on a loaf of bread when you bake it in the oven. The inside of the bread is soft, but the outside has a hard, distinct, baked layer. If you take a knife and scratch a word into the crust of that bread today, the scratch will cut right through the crust and expose the soft, fresh dough inside. Anyone looking at it with a magnifying glass can tell that the scratch was made after the crust was formed. But if you carve the word into the dough before you bake it, the crust will form naturally inside the grooves of the letters, matching the rest of the loaf perfectly. That is exactly how archaeological authentication works. If the inscription on the James ossuary was a modern forgery, the newly carved letters should cut right through the ancient patina, exposing fresh limestone underneath. If the inscription was ancient, the patina should grow continuously inside the grooves of the letters, matching the rest of the ancient box. The Israel Antiquities Authority claimed that their rigorous scientific tests showed the patina inside the letters was completely fake. They claimed it was a modern paste made of crushed chalk and boiling water, artificially applied by Oded Golan to look old and fool the experts. They used a highly sophisticated scientific method called oxygen-isotope analysis. They compared the oxygen isotopes in the patina of the ossuary to the oxygen isotopes found in cave speleothems, which are basically stalagmites growing in caves around Jerusalem. Because the isotopes on the box didn't match the isotopes in the cave stalagmites perfectly, the government declared it a definitive forgery. And this is exactly where the story stops being about a piece of limestone in Jerusalem and starts being about how authorities tell you what to believe. You trust the science, you trust the institution, because they have the mass spectrometers, they have the PhDs, and you don't. You take their word for it, just like you take their word for your health, your economy, and your history. If the government scientists say the oxygen isotopes prove it's a fake, it must be a fake. Here is something that seems to make absolutely no sense. The government's own absolute science was about to be turned against them in open court. And it is exactly here that the history gets incredibly important. The criminal trial of the State of Israel versus Oded Golan officially began in 2004. It took place in the Jerusalem District Court, presided over by Judge Aharon Farkash. For 7 grueling years, the prosecution paraded expert after expert to the witness stand to prove the inscription was a fake. But the defense did something nobody in the media expected. They brought in their own world-class scientists. Remember that oxygen isotope test? The one the government used as their absolute silver bullet to destroy the ossuary's credibility? A brutal geological critique from the University of Toledo completely dismantled it in front of the judge. The critique explained with devastating clarity that comparing the patina on a movable object like a burial box to a fixed stalagmite in a cave is scientifically flawed to the core. A stalagmite grows in a stable, temperature-controlled, enclosed environment over millennia. An ossuary gets moved around. It gets touched by human hands. It gets exposed to different temperatures, modern cleaning agents, and boiling water used to scrub it by amateur collectors. You absolutely cannot use cave speleothem isotopes as a baseline for an artifact that has been sitting in a collector's apartment for 30 years. The court listened. Judge Farkash accepted the expert testimony that oxygen isotope analysis of patina is simply not perfected and cannot be used to definitively determine whether an artifact is authentic or forged. The government's absolute, undeniable scientific proof evaporated right there on the witness stand. And what about that smoking gun? What about the literal forgery workshop found in Oded Golan's apartment? The police absolutely found tools and fake antiquities. Golan was actually convicted of lesser charges related to illegal antiquities trading and possessing suspected stolen goods, but after years of forensic testimony, the court found 0 physical evidence connecting that specific workshop to the James ossuary inscription. Furthermore, the defense presented a report from the Geological Survey of Israel, published all the way back in 2003, before the trial even began. Their independent scientific patina analysis concluded that no evidence that might detract from the authenticity of the patina and the inscription was found. They found that the exact same ancient patina layer covered both the letters and the rest of the stone. There is a mechanism that explains why the media stopped covering the trial when the government's case started falling apart. Before I show it to you, I need you to understand what the judge actually said when he finally brought the gavel down on this 7-year nightmare. On March 14, 2012, Judge Aharon Farkash delivered his final verdict. He acquitted Oded Golan of all forgery charges related to the James ossuary. But the judge was incredibly precise with his words, and you need to hear exactly what he said because it changes everything. He explicitly stated that the acquittal does not mean the inscription is authentic. It simply meant that the State of Israel had utterly failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a modern fake. Let that sink in for a moment. 12,000 pages of testimony, 7 years of the unlimited resources of a national government, 138 witnesses, and they could not prove it was a forgery. But look at how the world reacted. The hardcore skeptics immediately claimed the judge only let him off on a legal technicality and that the box was still obviously fake. The hardcore believers immediately claimed the court had legally proven the box was real and that Jesus' brother was confirmed. Neither side actually listened to the verdict. Neither side cared about the truth. They only cared about their narrative. And the story did not end in 2012. In 2014, a major archaeometric reanalysis was published in a scholarly review of patina and microfossils. These independent scientists examined the box all over again. They found that the patina on the ossuary surface perfectly matched the patina inside the engraved letters. But even more stunning than that, they found that microfossils within the inscription appeared to be naturally deposited over centuries, not artificially added by a modern forger using chalk paste. If you think this is just an isolated incident about an old box in Israel, wait a second. This is the exact same pattern we see everywhere. A discovery threatens the established narrative. The institution rushes to discredit it using absolute, unquestionable authority. The media amplifies the discredit and mocks anyone who questions it. And years later, when quiet, independent science actually looks at the data, the institutional certainty completely falls apart. It happens in archaeology, it happens in modern medicine, it happens in historical narratives all over the world. In every single place, the institutions react the exact same way to the exact same problem. And when you put all of this together, the result that forms is something completely unexpected. Because the real victim of the James ossuary trial wasn't the artifact. The artifact is just a piece of stone. The real victim is you. If you made it this far into the video, you are already in a very small, very specific group of people. The vast majority of people out there simply accept whatever the first headline tells them. They see a government institution declare something a forgery. They see a picture of a forgery workshop, and they close the book forever. They live their whole lives outsourcing their sense of truth to committees and authorities. You have already moved past that. You know the history now. You know how the mechanisms of scientific authentication can be flawed, manipulated, and weaponized in a courtroom to protect a narrative. You know that the oxygen isotopes and the microfossils tell a story that the evening news completely refused to cover. The only thing that separates simply knowing this information from actually transforming how you see the world is one thing: the willingness to act on it and dig deeper on your own. And that is exactly why I put together something specific for people who refuse to stop at the official narrative. If you are tired of history being filtered through institutional gatekeepers, you need the right tools to investigate it yourself. And that is where the Spinoza Forever Library comes in. It is a comprehensive, 5-volume digital collection of the most suppressed, debated, and foundational texts that shape our understanding of the ancient world and the historical Jesus. More than 10,000 people are already using these volumes to build their own independent understanding of history, completely outside the control of modern institutions. This exact combination of unedited, unfiltered texts is not something you will find in a standard university curriculum or a Sunday school library. It is available right now. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code you see on the screen right now to get your copy of the Spinoza Forever Library. The pact between you and the institutions that govern history might have been broken a long time ago. But there is a pact that nobody can break, because it doesn't depend on any committee, any judge, or any museum director. It is the pact between you and the raw, unfiltered reality of the past. The physical evidence is still in the ground. The texts are still waiting to be read. Who understands this early has a massive advantage over those who figure it out too late. I am going to leave it right there. But before you go, I want to hear from you. Are you on the side of the Israel Antiquities Authority, who believed the forgery workshop meant everything was tainted from the start? Or are you on the side of the independent scientists who say the microfossils in the stone simply cannot be faked? Which side are you on? Tell me in the comments. To really grasp the weight of what happened in that courtroom, we have to look deeper into the history of James himself. For centuries, the institutional church has minimized the role of James, the brother of Jesus, often referring to him merely as a cousin or a stepbrother to maintain the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. But the ancient texts, the ones that were not filtered by later councils, tell a very different story. James was not a background character. He was the undisputed leader of the early Jesus movement in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. He was known as James the Just. According to ancient historians like Flavius Josephus, James was a figure of immense authority, respected even by the Orthodox Jewish leadership of his time. When he was executed in the year 62, it sent shockwaves through the city. Imagine what it means if the bones of that specific man were actually placed in this exact limestone box. It completely reorganizes our understanding of early Christianity. It shifts the center of gravity away from Rome and back to Jerusalem, back to the biological family of Jesus. It proves that the movement was not just a theological abstraction, but a deeply rooted physical reality in first-century Judea. This is why the ossuary is so dangerous. It takes faith out of the realm of philosophy and drops it right into the middle of physical archaeology. And this is precisely why the Israel Antiquities Authority's reaction was so aggressive. When an institution is faced with physical evidence that challenges its foundational narrative, it does not adapt, it attacks. The use of oxygen-isotope analysis was presented to the public as cold, hard, objective science. But as the University of Toledo critique exposed, it was science weaponized for a specific purpose. They used a method designed for stalagmites in caves and applied it to a portable burial box, knowing full well that the general public would not understand the difference. They relied on the intimidation factor of the word isotope. This is the exact same mechanism used in every major historical cover-up. You blind the public with complex terminology. You parade experts in white coats who declare the case closed. You leak photos of a forgery workshop to the press to destroy the character of the owner. And you count on the fact that nobody is going to read a 12,000-page court transcript. But Judge Aharon Farkash read it. He sat there for 7 years and listened to the GSI geologists dismantle the IAA's claims piece by piece. He saw that the microfossils inside the Aramaic letters could not possibly have been placed there by a modern forger. He saw that the patina was unbroken. Think about the psychological toll of this entire saga. Oded Golan spent a decade of his life fighting the entire apparatus of the state. He was dragged through the mud, his reputation destroyed, his collection seized. And at the end of it all, the judge acquits him, but the media refuses to print the exoneration with the same massive headlines they used for his arrest. They just quietly moved on to the next scandal, leaving the public with the lingering impression that the box was a fake. But the stone does not care about media cycles. The limestone remains. The microfossils remain. The Aramaic letters, Yaakov bar Yosef akhui di Yeshua, remain exactly as they were carved 2,000 years ago. The physical evidence outlasts the institutional panic. And this brings us back to that conversation I had in the Catholic school library with the skeptical science teacher. He told me I couldn't dig up God with a trowel. And maybe he was right about that. But what you can dig up is the physical truth of the people who walked the earth. You can dig up the boxes they were buried in. You can dig up the words they carved into stone. And when you do, you force the institutions to show their true colors. You force them to spend millions of dollars trying to crush a piece of limestone simply because it doesn't fit the story they are trying to sell you. The story of the James ossuary is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the modern world. It shows us exactly how power protects itself. It shows us how science can be bent to serve an agenda, and how the legal system can be used to exhaust anyone who challenges the official narrative. But it also shows us something incredibly hopeful. It shows us that truth is remarkably resilient. Even after 7 years, after a barrage of institutional attacks, the simple physical reality of the stone prevailed. The microfossils held their ground. The patina told its story. And now, you know that story too. You no longer have to rely on the encyclopedias that stop at 1990. You no longer have to take the word of a committee just because they have official titles. You have the ability to look at the evidence yourself, to understand the mechanisms of control, and to make your own decisions. This is what true historical investigation looks like. It is not about accepting easy answers. It is about demanding the raw data and being willing to face whatever truth emerges from the dust.